Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories from the public domain. We are currently reading through Cranford, written in 1853 by Elizabeth Gaskell. And without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 8, Your Ladyship. Early the next morning, directly after 12, Miss Pole made her appearance at Miss Matty's. Some very trifling piece of business was alleged as a reason for the call, but there was evidently something behind. At last, out it came. "By the way, you'll think I'm strangely ignorant, but do you really know I am puzzled how we ought to address Lady Glenmire? Do you say your ladyship, where you would say you to a common person? I have been puzzling all morning. And are we to say my lady instead of ma'am? Now you knew Lady R.E.Langille. Would you kindly tell me the most correct way of speaking to the peerage?" Poor Miss Matty. She took off her spectacles and she put them on again. But how Lady R.E.Langille was addressed she could not remember. "It is so long ago," she said. Dear, how stupid I am. I don't think I ever saw her more than twice. I know we used to call Sir Peter, but he came much oftener to see us than Lady R.E.Langille did. Deborah would have known in a minute. My lady, your ladyship, it sounds very strange, and as if it was not natural. I never thought of it before, but now you have named it, I am all in a puzzle." It was very certain Miss Pole would obtain no wise decision from Miss Matty, who got more bewildered every moment and more perplexed as to etiquettes of address. "Well, I really think," said Miss Pole, "I had better just go and tell Mrs. Forrester about our little difficulty. One sometimes grows nervous, and yet one would not have Lady Glenmire think we are quite ignorant of the etiquettes of high life in Cranford." "And will you just step in here, dear Miss Pole, as you come back, please, and tell me what you decide upon? Whatever you and Mrs. Forrester fix upon will be quite right, I'm sure. Lady R.E.Langille, Sir Peter," said Miss Matty to herself, trying to recall the old forms of words. "Who is Lady Glenmire?" asked I. "Oh, she's the widow of Mr. Jameson. That's Mrs. Jameson's late husband, you know, widow of his eldest brother. Mrs. Jameson was a Miss Walker, daughter of Governor Walker. Your ladyship, my dear, if they fix on that way of speaking, you must just let me practice a little on you first, for I shall feel so foolish and hot saying it first time to Lady Glenmire." It was really a relief to Miss Matty when Mrs. Jameson came on a very unpolite errand. I noticed that apathetic people have more quiet impertinence than others, and Mrs. Jameson came now to insinuate pretty plainly that she did not particularly wish that the Cranford ladies should call upon her sister-in-law. I can hardly say how she made this clear, for I grew very indignant and warm, while, with slow deliberation, she was explaining her wishes to Miss Matty, who, a true lady herself, could hardly understand the feeling which made Mrs. Jameson wish to appear to her noble sister-in-law as if she only visited country families. Miss Matty remained puzzled and perplexed long after I had found out the object of Mrs. Jameson's visit. When she did understand the drift of the honourable lady's call, it was pretty to see with what quiet dignity she received the intimation thus uncourteously given. She was not in the least hurt. She was of too gentle a spirit for that. Nor was she exactly conscious of disapproving of Miss Jameson's conduct. But there was something of this feeling in her mind, I am sure, which made her pass from the subject to others in a less flurried and more composed manner than usual. Mrs. Jameson was, indeed, the more flurried of the two, and I could see she was glad to take her leave. A little while afterward, Miss Pole returned, red and indignant. "Well, to be sure, you've had Mrs. Jameson here. I find from Martha, and we are not to call on Lady Glenmire. Yes, I met Mrs. Jameson halfway between here and Mrs. Forrester's, and she told me. She took me so by surprise, I had nothing to say. I wish I had thought of something very sharp and sarcastic. I dare say I shall tonight. And Lady Glenmire is but the widow of a Scotch baron after all. I went on to look at Mrs. Forrester's peerage to see who this lady was, that is to be kept under a glass case. Widow of a Scotch peer, never sat in the House of Lords, and as poor as Job, I dare say, and she fifth daughter of some Mr. Campbell or other. You are the daughter of a rector at any rate, and related to the Earleys, and Sir Peter might have been Viscount Earley, everyone says. Miss Matty tried to soothe Miss Pole, but in vain. That lady, usually so kind and good-humoured, was now in a full flow of anger. "And I went and ordered a cap this morning to be quite ready," said she at last, letting out the secret which gave sting to Mrs. Jameson's intimation. "Mrs. Jameson shall see if it is so easy to get me to make fourth at pool when she has none of her fine Scotch relations with her." In coming out of church, the first Sunday on which Lady Glenmire appeared in Cranford, we sedulously talked together, and turned our backs on Mrs. Jameson and her guest. If we might not call on her, we would not even look at her, though we were dying with curiosity to know what she was like. We had the comfort of questioning Martha in the afternoon. Martha did not belong to a sphere of society whose observation could be an implied compliment to Lady Glenmire, and Martha made good use of her eyes. "Well, ma'am, is it the little lady with Mrs. Jameson, you mean? I thought you would like more to know how young Mrs. Smith was dressed, her being a bride." Mrs. Smith was the butcher's wife. Miss Pole said, "Good gracious me, as if we cared about a Mrs. Smith," but was silent as Martha resumed her speech. "The little lady in Mrs. Jameson's pew had on, ma'am, rather an old black silk, and a shepherd's plaid cloak, ma'am, and very bright black eyes she had, ma'am, and a pleasant sharp face, not over young, ma'am, but yet, I should guess, younger than Mrs. Jameson herself. She looked up and down the church like a bird, and nipped up her petticoats when she came out, as quick and sharp as ever I see. I'll tell you what, ma'am, she's more like Mrs. Deacon at the Coach and Horses nor anyone." "Hush, Martha," said Miss Matty. "That's not respectful." "Isn't it, ma'am? I beg pardon, I'm sure, but Jem Hearn said so as well. He said she was just a sharp, stirring sort of a body." "Lady," said Miss Poole. "Lady, as Mrs. Bacon." Another Sunday passed away, and we still averted our eyes from Mrs. Jameson and her guest, and made remarks to ourselves that we thought were very severe, almost too much so. Miss Matty was evidently uneasy at our sarcastic manner of speaking. Perhaps by this time Lady Glenmire had found out that Mrs. Jameson was not the gayest, liveliest house in the world. Perhaps Mrs. Jameson had found out that most of the country families were in London, and that those who remained in the country were not so alive as they might have been to the circumstance of Lady Glenmire being in their neighbourhood. Great events spring out of small causes, so I will not pretend to say what induced Mrs. Jameson to alter her determination of excluding the Cranford ladies and send notes of invitation all round for a small party on the following Tuesday. Mr. Mulliner himself brought them round. He would always ignore the fact of there being a back door to any house, and gave a louder rat-tat than his mistress, Mrs. Jameson. He had 3 little notes which he carried in a large basket, in order to impress his mistress with an idea of their great weight, though they might easily have gone into his waistcoat pocket. Miss Matty and I quietly decided that we would have a previous engagement at home. It was the evening on which Miss Matty usually made candle-lighters of all the notes and letters of the week, for on Mondays her accounts were always made straight, not a penny owing from the week before. So, by a natural arrangement, making candle-lighters fell upon a Tuesday evening, and gave us a legitimate excuse for declining Mrs. Jameson's invitation. But before our answer was written, in came Miss Pole with an open note in her hand. "So," she said, I see you have got your note too. Better late than never. I could have told my Lady Glenmire she would be glad enough of our society before a fortnight was over." "Yes," said Miss Matty. "We are asked for Tuesday evening, and perhaps you would just kindly bring your work across and drink tea with us that night. It is my usual regular time for looking over the last week's bills and notes and letters, and making candle-lighters of them. But that does not seem quite reason enough for saying I have a previous engagement at home, though I meant to make it do. Now, if you would come, my conscience would be quite at ease, and luckily the note is not written yet." I saw Miss Pole's countenance change while Miss Matty was speaking. "Don't you mean to go, then?" asked she. "Oh, no," said Miss Matty quietly. "You don't either, I suppose?" "I don't know," replied Miss Pole. "Yes, I think I do," said she, rather briskly, and on seeing Miss Matty look surprised, she added, "You see, one would not like Mrs. Jameson to think that anything she could do or say was of consequence enough to give offence. It would be a kind of letting down of ourselves that I, for one, should not like. It would be too flattering to Mrs. Jameson if we allowed her to suppose that what she had said affected us a week, nay, 10 days afterwards. Well, I suppose it is wrong to be hurt and annoyed so long about anything, and perhaps after all she did not mean to vex us. But I must say I could not have brought myself to say the things Mrs. Jameson did about our not calling. I really don't think I shall go." "Oh, come, Miss Matty, you must go. You know our friend Mrs. Jameson is much more phlegmatic than most people, and does not enter into the little delicacies of feeling which you possess in so remarkable a degree." "I thought you possessed them too that day Mrs. Jameson called to tell us not to go," said Miss Matty innocently. But Miss Pole, in addition to her delicacies of feeling, possessed a very smart cap, which she was anxious to show to an admiring world. And so she seemed to forget all her angry words uttered not a fortnight before, and to be ready to act on what she called the great Christian principle of forgive and forget. And she lectured dear Miss Matty so long on this head that she absolutely ended by assuring her it was her duty, as a deceased rector's daughter, to buy a new cap and go to the party at Mrs. Jameson's. So we were most happy to accept, instead of regretting that we were obliged to decline. The expenditure on dress in Cranford was principally in that one article referred to. If the heads were buried in smart new caps, the ladies were like ostriches, and cared not what became of their bodies. Old gowns, white and venerable collars, any number of brooches up and down and everywhere, some with dogs' eyes painted in them, some that were like small picture frames with mausoleums and weeping willows neatly executed in hair and side, some again with miniatures of ladies and gentlemen sweetly smiling out of a nest of stiff muslin. Old brooches for a permanent ornament, and new caps to suit the fashion of the day. The ladies of Cranford always dressed with chaste elegance and propriety, as Miss Barker once prettily expressed it, and with 3 new caps and a greater array of brooches than had ever been seen together at one time since Cranford was a town, did Mrs. Forrester and Miss Matty and Miss Pole appear on that memorable Tuesday evening. I counted 7 brooches myself on Miss Pole's dress. 2 were fixed negligently in her cap. One was a butterfly made of Scotch pebbles, which a vivid imagination might believe to be the real insect. One fastened her neckerchief, one her collar, one ornamented the front of her gown, midway between her throat and waist, and another adorned the point of her stomacher. Where the 7th was, I have forgotten, but it was somewhere about her, I am sure. But I am getting on too fast in describing the dresses of the company. I should first relate the gathering on the way to Mrs. Jameson's. That lady lived in a large house just outside the town. A road which had known what it was to be a street ran right before the house, which opened out upon it without any intervening garden or court. Whatever the sun was about, he never shone on the front of that house. To be sure, the living rooms were at the back, looking onto a pleasant garden. The front windows only belonged to kitchens and housekeepers' rooms and pantries, and in one of them Mr. Mulliner was reported to sit. Indeed, looking askance, we often saw the back of a head covered with hair powder, which also extended itself over his coat collar down to his very waist. And this imposing back was always engaged in reading the St. James Chronicle, opened wide, which in some degree accounted for the length of time the said newspaper was in reaching us. Equal subscribers with Mrs. Jameson, though, in right of her honourableness, she always had the reading of it first. This very Tuesday the delay in forwarding the last number had been particularly aggravating. Just when both Miss Pole and Miss Matty, the former more especially, had been wanting to see it in order to coach up the court news ready for the evening's interview with aristocracy. Miss Pole told us she had absolutely taken time by the forelock and been dressed by 5 o'clock in order to be ready if the St. James Chronicle should come in at the last moment. The very St. James Chronicle which the powdered head was tranquilly and composedly reading as we passed the accustomed window this evening. "The impudence of the man!" said Miss Pole in a low, indignant whisper. "I should like to ask him whether his mistress pays her quarter share for his exclusive use." We looked at her in admiration of the courage of her thought, for Mr. Mulliner was an object of great awe to all of us. He seemed never to have forgotten his condescension in coming to live at Cranford. Miss Jenkins, at times, had stood forth as the undaunted champion of her sex, and spoken to him on terms of equality, but even Miss Jenkins could get no higher. In his pleasantest and most gracious moods, he looked like a sulky cockatoo. He did not speak except in gruff monosyllables. He would wait in the hall when we begged him not to wait, and then looked deeply offended because we had kept him there, while, with trembling, hasty hands, we prepared ourselves for appearing in company. Miss Pole ventured on a small joke as we went upstairs, intended, though addressed to us, to afford Mr. Mulliner some slight amusement. We all smiled in order to seem as if we felt at our ease, and timidly looked for Mr. Mulliner's sympathy. Not a muscle of that wooden face had relaxed, and we were grave in an instant. Mrs. Jameson's drawing-room was cheerful. The evening sun came streaming into it, and the large square window was clustered round with flowers. The furniture was white and gold, not the later style, Louis XIV, I think they call it, all shells and twirls. No, Mrs. Jameson's chairs and tables had not a curve or bend about them. The chair and table legs diminished as they neared the ground, and were straight and square in all their corners. The chairs were all a row against the walls, with the exception of 4 or 5 which stood in a circle round the fire. They were railed with white bars across the back and knobbed with gold. Neither the railings nor the knobs invited to ease. There was a japanned table devoted to literature, on which lay a Bible, a peerage, and a prayer book. There was another square Pembroke table dedicated to the finer arts, on which were a kaleidoscope, conversation cards, puzzle cards, tied together to an interminable length with faded pink satin ribbon, and a box painted in fond imitation of the drawings which decorate tea-chests. Carlo lay on the worsted-worked rug, and ungraciously barked at us as we entered. Mrs. Jameson stood up, giving us each a torpid smile of welcome, and looking helplessly beyond us at Mr. Mulliner, as if she hoped he would place us in chairs, for, if he did not, she never could. I suppose he thought we could find our way to the circle round the fire, which reminded me of Stonehenge. I don't know why. Lady Glenmire came to the rescue of our hostess, and somehow or other we found ourselves for the first time placed agreeably, and not formally, in Mrs. Jameson's house. Lady Glenmire, now we had time to look at her, proved to be a bright little woman of middle age, who had been very pretty in the days of her youth, and who was even yet very pleasant-looking. I saw Miss Pole appraising her dress in the first 5 minutes, and I take her word when she said the next day, "My dear, £10 would have purchased every stitch she had on, lace and all." It was pleasant to suspect that a peeress could be poor, and partly reconciled us to the fact that her husband had never sat in the House of Lords, which, when we first heard of it, seemed a kind of swindling us out of our prospects on false pretenses, a sort of a lord and no lord business. We were all very silent at first. We were thinking what we would talk about, that should be high enough to interest my lady. There had been a rise in the price of sugar, which, as preserving time was near, was a piece of intelligence to all our housekeeping hearts, and would have been the natural topic if Lady Glenmire had not been by. But we were not sure if the peerage ate preserves, much less knew how they were made. At last, Miss Pole, who had always a great deal of courage and savoir-faire, spoke to Lady Glenmire, who, on her part, had seemed just as much puzzled to know how to break the silence as we were. "Has your ladyship been to court lately?" asked she, and then gave a little glance round at us, half timid and half triumphant, as much as to say, "See how judiciously I have chosen a subject befitting the rank of a new stranger." "I never was there in me life," said Lady Glenmire, with a broad Scotch accent, but in a very sweet voice. And then, as if she had been too abrupt, she added, "We very seldom went to London. Only twice, in fact, during all my married life. And before I was married, my father had far too large a family." Fifth daughter of Mr. Campbell was in all our minds, I am sure. "To take us often from our home, even to Edinburgh. You'll have been in Edinburgh, maybe," said she, suddenly brightening up with the hope of a common interest. We had none of us been there, but Miss Pole had an uncle who once had passed the night there, which was very pleasant. Mrs. Jameson, meanwhile, was absorbed in wonder why Mr. Mulliner did not bring the tea, and at length the wonder oozed out of her mouth. "I had better ring the bell, my dear, had I not?" said Lady Glenmire briskly. "No, I think not. Mulliner does not like to be hurried." We should have liked our tea, for we dined at an earlier hour than Mrs. Jameson. I suspect Mr. Mulliner had to finish the St. James Chronicle before he chose to trouble himself about the tea. His mistress fidgeted and kept saying, "I can't think why Mulliner does not bring tea. I can't think what he can be about." And Lady Glenmire at last grew quite impatient, but it was a pretty kind of impatience after all, and she rang the bell rather sharply on receiving a half permission from her sister-in-law to do so. Mr. Mulliner appeared in dignified surprise. "Oh," said Mrs. Jameson, "Lady Glenmire rang the bell. I believe it was for tea." In a few minutes tea was brought. Very delicate was the china, very old the plate, very thin the bread and butter, and very small the lumps of sugar. Sugar was evidently Mrs. Jameson's favourite economy. I question if the little filigree sugar tongs, made something like scissors, could have opened themselves wide enough to take up an honest, vulgar, good-sized piece. And when I tried to seize 2 little minikin pieces at once, so as not to be detected in too many returns to the sugar basin, they absolutely dropped one, with a little sharp clatter, quite in a malicious and unnatural manner. But before this happened, we had had a slight disappointment. In the little silver jug was cream, in the larger one was milk. As soon as Mr. Mulliner came in, Carlo began to beg, which was a thing our manners forbade us to do. Though I am sure we were just as hungry, and Mrs. Jameson said she was certain we would excuse her if she gave her poor dumb Carlo his tea first. She accordingly mixed a saucerful for him and put it down for him to lap, and then she told us how intelligent and sensible the dear little fellow was. He knew cream quite well, and constantly refused tea with only milk in it. So the milk was left for us, but we silently thought we were quite as intelligent and sensible as Carlo, and felt as if insult were added to injury when we were called upon to admire the gratitude evinced by his wagging his tail for the cream, which should have been ours. After tea, we thawed down into common life subjects. We were thankful to Lady Glenmire for having proposed some more bread and butter, and this mutual want made us better acquainted with her than we should ever have been with talking about the court, though Miss Pole did say she had hoped to know how the dear Queen was from someone who had seen her. The friendship begun over bread and butter extended on to cards. Lady Glenmire played preference to admiration, and was a complete authority as to ombre and quadrille. Even Miss Pole quite forgot to say, "My lady," and "your ladyship," and said, "Basto, ma'am, you have spadille, I believe," just as quietly as if we had never held the great Cranford Parliament on the subject of the proper mode of addressing a peeress. As a proof of how thoroughly we had forgotten that we were in the presence of one who might have sat down to tea with a coronet instead of a cap on her head, Mrs. Forrester related a curious little fact to Lady Glenmire. An anecdote known to the circle of her intimate friends, but of which even Mrs. Jameson was not aware. It related to some fine old lace, the sole relic of better days, which Lady Glenmire was admiring on Mrs. Forrester's collar. "Yes," said the lady, "such lace cannot be got now for either love or money. Made by the nuns abroad, they tell me. They say that they can't make it now even there, but perhaps they can, now they've passed the Catholic Emancipation Bill. I should not wonder. But in the meantime, I've treasure up my lace very much. I daren't even trust the washing of it to my maid." The little charity schoolgirl I have named before, but who sounded well as my maid. "I always wash it myself, and once it had a narrow escape. Of course, your ladyship knows that such lace must never be starched or ironed. Some people wash it in sugar and water, and some in coffee, to make it the right yellow colour. But I myself have a very good receipt for washing it in milk, which stiffens it enough and gives it a very good creamy colour. Well, ma'am, I had tacked it together, and the beauty of this fine lace is that when it is wet, it goes into a very little space. I put it to soak in milk, when, unfortunately, I left the room. On my return, I found Pussy on the table, looking very like a thief, but gulping very uncomfortably, as if she was half chocked with something she wanted to swallow and could not. And would you believe it? At first I pitied her and said, poor pussy, till all at once I looked and saw the cup of milk empty, cleaned out. "You naughty cat," said I, and I believe I was provoked enough to give her a little slap, which did no good, but only helped the lace down, just as one slaps a choking child on the back. I could have cried. I was so vexed. But I determined I would not give the lace up without a struggle for it. I hoped the lace might disagree with her, at any rate, but it would have been too much for Job if he had seen, as I did, that cat come in, quite placid and purring, not a quarter of an hour after, and almost expecting to be struck. "No, Pussy," said I, "if you have any conscience, you ought not to expect that." And then a thought struck me, and I rang the bell for my maid, and I sent her to Mr. Hoggins with my compliments, and would he be kind enough to lend me one of his top boots for an hour. I did not think there was anything odd in the message, but Jenny said the young men in the surgery laughed as if they would be ill at my wanting a top boot. When it came, Jenny and I put Pussy in, with her 4 feet straight down, so that they were fastened and could not scratch, and we gave her a teaspoonful of currant jelly, in which, your lady must excuse me, I had mixed some tartar emetic. I shall never forget how anxious I was for that next half hour. I took Pussy to my own room and spread a clean towel on the floor. I could have kissed her when she returned the lace to sight, very much as it had gone down. Jenny had boiling water ready, and we soaked it and spread it on a lavender bush in the sun before I could touch it again, even to put it in milk. But now your ladyship would never guess that it had been in Pussy's insides. We found out in the course of the evening that Lady Glenmire was going to pay Mrs. Jameson a long visit, as she had given up her apartments in Edinburgh, and had no ties to take her back there in a hurry. On the whole, we were rather glad to hear this, for she had made a pleasant impression upon us, and it was also very comfortable to find, from things which dropped out in the course of conversation, that, in addition to many other genteel qualities, she was far removed from the vulgarity of wealth. "Don't you find it very unpleasant walking?" asked Mrs. Jameson, as our respective servants were announced. It was a pretty regular question from Mrs. Jameson, who had her own carriage in the coach-house, and always went out in a sedan chair to the very shortest distances. The answers were nearly as much a matter of course. "Oh dear, no! It is so pleasant and still at night. Such a refreshment after the excitement of a party. The stars are so beautiful." This last was from Miss Matty. "Are you fond of astronomy?" Lady Glenmire asked. "Not very," replied Miss Matty, rather confused at the moment to remember which was astronomy and which was astrology. But the answer was true under either circumstance, for she read and was slightly alarmed at Francis Moore's astrological predictions, and as to astronomy, in a private and confidential conversation, she had told me she never could believe that the earth was moving constantly, and that she would not believe it if she could. It made her feel so tired and dizzy whenever she thought about it. In our patterns, we picked our way home with extra care that night. So refined and delicate were our perceptions after drinking tea with my lady. Chapter 9. Signor Brunoni. Soon after the events of which I gave an account in my last paper, I was summoned home by my father's illness, and for a time I forgot, in anxiety about him, to wonder how my dear friends at Cranford were getting on, or how Lady Glenmire could reconcile herself to the dullness of the long visit which she was still paying to her sister-in-law, Mrs. Jameson. When my father grew a little stronger, I accompanied him to the seaside, so that altogether I seemed banished from Cranford, and was deprived of the opportunity of hearing any chance intelligence of the dear little town for the greater part of that year. Late in November, when we had returned home again, and my father was once more in good health, I received a letter from Miss Matty, and a very mysterious letter it was. She began many sentences without ending them, running them one into another in much the same confused sort of way in which written words run together on blotting paper. All I could make out was that, if my father was better, which she hoped he was, and would take warning, and wear a greatcoat from Michaelmas to Lady Day, if turbans were in fashion, could I tell her? Such a piece of gaiety was going to happen as had not been seen or known of since Wombwell's lions came, when one of them ate a little child's arm, and she was, perhaps, too old to care about dress, but a new cap she must have, and having heard that turbans were worn, and some of the country families likely to come, she would like to look tidy, if I would bring her a cap from the milliner I employed. And oh dear, how careless of her to forget that she wrote to beg I would come and pay her a visit next Tuesday, when she hoped to have something to offer me in the way of amusement, which she would not now more particularly describe, only sea green was her favourite colour. So she ended her letter, but in a P.S. she added she thought she might as well tell me what was the peculiar attraction to Cranford just now. Signor Brunoni was going to exhibit his wonderful magic at the Cranford Assembly Rooms on Wednesday and Friday evening in the following week. I was very glad to accept the invitation from my dear Miss Matty, independently of the conjurer, and most particularly anxious to prevent her from disfiguring her small, gentle, mousy face with a great Saracen's head turban. And accordingly I bought her a pretty, neat, middle-aged cap, which, however, was rather a disappointment to her when, on my arrival, she followed me to my bedroom, ostensibly to poke the fire, but in reality, I do believe, to see if the sea-green turban was not inside the cap-box with which I had travelled. It was in vain that I twirled the cap round on my hand to exhibit back and side fronts. Her heart had been set upon a turban, and all she could do was to say with resignation in her look and voice, "I am sure you did your best, my dear. It is just like all the caps all the ladies in Cranford are wearing, and they have had theirs for a year, I dare say. I should have liked something newer, I confess, something more like the turbans Miss Betty Barker tells me Queen Adelaide wears. But it is very pretty, my dear, and I dare say lavender will wear better than sea green. Well, after all, what is dress that we should care anything about it? You'll tell me if you want anything, my dear. Here is the bell. I suppose turbans have not got down to Drumble yet?" So saying, the dear old lady gently bemoaned herself out of the room, leaving me to dress for the evening, when, as she informed me, she expected Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester, and she hoped I should not feel myself too much tired to join the party. Of course I should not, and I made some haste to unpack and arrange my dress. But with all my speed, I heard the arrivals and the buzz of conversation in the next room before I was ready. Just as I opened the door, I caught the words, "I was foolish to expect anything very genteel out of the Drumble shops. Poor girl, she did her best, I've no doubt." But for all that, I had rather she blamed Drumble and me than disfigured herself with a turban. Miss Pole was always the person, in the trio of Cranford ladies now assembled, to have had adventures. She was in the habit of spending the morning and rambling from shop to shop, not to purchase anything, except an occasional reel of cotton or a piece of tape, but to see the new articles and report upon them, and to collect all the stray pieces of intelligence in the town. She had a way, too, of demurely popping hither and thither into all sorts of places to gratify her curiosity on any point, a way which, if she had not looked so very genteel and prim, might have been considered impertinent. And now, by the expressive way in which she cleared her throat and waited for all minor subjects, such as caps and turbans, to be cleared off the course, we knew she had something very particular to relate, when the due pause came. And I defy any people possessed of common modesty to keep up a conversation long, where one among them sits up aloft in silence, looking down upon all the things they chance to say as trivial and contemptible, compared to what they could disclose if properly entreated. Miss Pole began. As I was stepping out of Gordon's shop day, I chanced to go into the George. My Betty has a second cousin who is chambermaid there, and I thought Betty would like to hear how she was. And not seeing anyone about, I strolled up the staircase, and found myself in the passage leading to the assembly-room. You and I remember the assembly-room, I am sure, Miss Matty, and the minuets de la cour. So I went on, not thinking of what I was about, when all at once I perceived that I was in the middle of the preparations for tomorrow night, the room being divided with many great clothes-maids, over which Crosby's men were tacking red flannel, very dark and odd it seemed. It quite bewildered me, and I was going on behind the screens in my absence of mind, when a gentleman, quite the gentleman, I can assure you, stepped forward and asked if I had any business he could arrange for me. He spoke such pretty broken English, I could not help thinking of Thaddeus of Warsaw, and the Hungarian brothers, and Santo Sebastiani, and while I was busy picturing his past life to myself, he had bowed me out of the room. Oh, but wait a minute, you have not heard half my story yet. I was going downstairs when who should I meet but Betty's second cousin. So of course I stopped to speak to her for Betty's sake, and she told me that I had really seen the conjurer. The gentleman who spoke broken English was Signor Brunoni himself. Just at this moment he passed us on the stairs, making such a graceful bow, in reply to which I dropped a curtsy. All foreigners have such polite manners, one catches something of it. But when he had gone downstairs, I bethought me that I had dropped my glove in the assembly-room. It was safe in my muff all the time, but I never found it till afterwards. So I went back, and just as I was creeping up the passage left on one side of the great screen that goes nearly across the room, who should I see but the very same gentleman that had met me before and passed me on the stairs, coming not forward from the inner part of the room, to which there is no entrance, you remember, Miss Matty, and just repeating in his pretty broken English the inquiry if I had any business there. I don't mean that he put it so bluntly, but he seemed very determined that I should not pass the screen. So, of course, I explained about my glove, which, curiously enough, I found at that very moment. Miss Pole, then, had seen the conjurer, the real, live conjurer, and numerous were the questions we all asked her. Had he a beard? Was he young or old? Fair or dark? Did he look? Unable to shape my question prudently, I put it in another form. How did he look? In short, Miss Pole was the heroine of the evening, owing to her morning's encounter. If she was not the rose, that is to say, the conjurer, she had been near it. Conjuration, sleight of hand, magic, witchcraft were the subjects of the evening. Miss Pole was slightly sceptical and inclined to think there might be a scientific solution found for even the proceedings of the Witch of Endor. Mrs. Forrester believed everything, from ghosts to death watches. Miss Matty ranged between the two, always convinced by the last speaker. I think she was naturally more inclined to Mrs. Forrester's side, but a desire of proving herself a worthy sister to Miss Jenkins kept her equally balanced. Miss Jenkins, who would never allow a servant to call the little rolls of tallow that formed themselves round candles winding sheets, but insisted on their being spoken of as roly-polies. A sister of hers to be superstitious! It would never do. After tea, I was dispatched downstairs into the dining parlour for that volume of the old encyclopedia, which contains the nouns beginning with C, in order that Miss Pole might prime herself with scientific explanations for the tricks of the following evening. It spoilt the pool at Preference, which Miss Matty and Mrs. Forrester had been looking forward to, for Miss Pole became so much absorbed in her subject, and the plates by which it was illustrated, that we felt it would be cruel to disturb her otherwise than by one or two well-timed yawns, which I threw in now and then, for I was really touched by the meek way in which the two ladies were bearing their disappointment. But Miss Pole only read the more zealously, imparting to us no more information than this. Ah, I see. I comprehend perfectly. A represents the ball. Put A between B and D. No, between C and F, and turn the second joint of the third finger on your left hand over the wrist of your right. H. Very clear indeed. My dear Mrs. Forrester, conjuring and witchcraft is a mere affair of the alphabet. Do let me read you this one passage. Mrs. Forrester implored Miss Pole to spare her, saying from a child upwards she never could understand being read aloud to, and I dropped the pack of cards, which I had been shuffling very audibly, and by this discreet movement I obliged Miss Pole to perceive that Preference was to have been the order of the evening, and to propose rather unwillingly that the pool should commence. The pleasant brightness that stole over the other two ladies' faces on this. Miss Matty had one or two twinges of self-reproach for having interrupted Miss Pole in her studies, and did not remember her cards well, or give her full attention to the game, until she had soothed her conscience by offering to lend the volume of the encyclopedia to Miss Pole, who accepted it thankfully, and said Betty should take it home when she came with the lantern. The next evening we were all in a little gentle flutter at the idea of the gaiety before us. Miss Matty went up to dress betimes, and hurried me until I was ready, when we found we had an hour and a half to wait before the doors opened at 7 precisely, and we had only 20 yards to go. However, as Miss Matty said, it would not do to get too much absorbed in anything and forget the time, so she thought we'd better sit quietly, without lighting the candles, till 5 minutes to 7. So Miss Matty dozed, and I knitted. At length we set off, and at the door under the carriageway at the George we met Mrs. Forrester and Miss Pole. The latter was discussing the subject of the evening with more vehemence than ever, and throwing X's and B's at our heads like hailstones. She had even copied one or two of the receipts, as she called them, for the different tricks, on backs of letters, ready to explain and to detect Signor Brunoni's arts. We went into the cloakroom adjoining the assembly room. Miss Matty gave a sigh or two at her departed youth, and the remembrance of the last time she had been there, as she adjusted her pretty new cap before the strange, quaint old mirror in the cloakroom. The assembly room had been added to the inn about 100 years before by the different country families who met together there once a month during the winter to dance and play at cards. Many a country beauty had first swung through the minuet that she afterwards danced before Queen Charlotte in this very room. It was said that one of the Gunnings had graced the apartment with her beauty. It was certain that a rich and beautiful widow, Lady Williams, had here been smitten with the noble figure of a young artist who was staying with some family in the neighbourhood for professional purposes, and accompanied his patrons to the Cranford assembly. And a pretty bargain poor Lady Williams had of her handsome husband, if all the tales were true. Now, no beauty blushed and dimpled along the sides of the Cranford assembly room. No handsome artist won hearts by his bow, chapeau bras in hand. The old room was dingy. The salmon-coloured paint had faded into a drab. Great pieces of plaster had chipped off from the fine wreaths and festoons on its walls. But still, a mouldy odour of aristocracy lingered about the place, and a dusty recollection of the days that were gone made Miss Matty and Mrs. Forrester bridle up as they entered, and walk mincingly up the room, as if they were a number of genteel observers, instead of two little boys with a stick of toffee between them, with which to beguile the time. We stopped short at the second front row. I could hardly understand why, until I heard Miss Pole ask a stray waiter if any of the country families were expected, and when he shook his head and believed not, Mrs. Forrester and Miss Matty moved forwards, and our party represented a conversational square. The front row was soon augmented and enriched by Lady Glenmire and Mrs. Jameson. We 6 occupied the 2 front rows, and our aristocratic seclusion was respected by the groups of shopkeepers who strayed in from time to time and huddled together on the back benches. At least, I conjectured so from the noise they made and the sonorous bumps they gave in sitting down. But when, in wariness of the obstinate green curtain that would not draw up, but would stare at me with 2 odd eyes, seen through holes, as in the old tapestry story, I would fain have looked round at the merry, chattering people behind me. Miss Pole clutched my arm, and begged me not to turn, for it is not the thing. What the thing was, I never could find out, but it must have been something eminently dull and tiresome. However, we all sat, eyes right, square front, gazing at the tantalizing curtain, and hardly speaking intelligibly. We were so afraid of being caught in the vulgarity of making any noise in a place of public amusement. Mrs. Jameson was the most fortunate, for she fell asleep. At length the eyes disappeared, the curtain quivered, one side went up before the other, which stuck fast, it was dropped again, and with a fresh effort and a vigorous pull from some unseen hand, it flew up, revealing to our sight a magnificent gentleman in the Turkish costume, seated before a little table, gazing at us. I should have said with the same eyes that I had last seen through the hole in the curtain, with calm and condescending dignity, like a being of another sphere, as I heard a sentimental voice ejaculate behind me. "That's not Signor Brunoni," said Miss Pole, decidedly, and so audibly that I am sure he heard, for he glanced down over his flowing beard at our party with an air of mute reproach. "Signor Brunoni had no beard, but perhaps he'll come soon." So she lulled herself into patience. Meanwhile, Miss Matty had reconnoitred through her eyeglass, wiped it, and looked again. Then she turned round and said to me in a kind of mild, sorrowful tone, "You see, my dear, turbans are worn." But we had no time for more conversation. The Grand Turk, as Miss Pole chose to call him, arose and announced himself as Signor Brunoni. "I don't believe him!" exclaimed Miss Pole in a defiant manner. He looked at her again with the same dignified upbraiding in his countenance. "I don't," she repeated more positively than ever. "Signor Brunoni has not got that muffy sort of thing about his chin, but looked like a close-shaved Christian gentleman." Miss Pole's energetic speeches had the good effect of wakening up Mrs. Jameson, who opened her eyes wide in sign of the deepest attention, a proceeding which silenced Miss Pole and encouraged the Grand Turk to proceed, which he did in very broken English. So broken that there was no cohesion between the parts of his sentences, a fact which he himself perceived at last, and so left off speaking and proceeded to action. Now, we were astonished. How he did his tricks I could not imagine. No, not even when Miss Pole pulled out her pieces of paper and began reading aloud, or at least in a very audible whisper, the separate receipts for the most common of his tricks. If ever I saw a man frown and look enraged, I saw the Grand Turk frown at Miss Pole. But as she said, what could be expected of unchristian looks from a Mussulman? If Miss Pole were skeptical, and more engrossed with her receipts and diagrams than with his tricks, Miss Matty and Mrs. Forrester were mystified and perplexed to the highest degree. Mrs. Jameson kept taking her spectacles off and wiping them, as if she thought it was something defective in them, which made the legerdemain. And Lady Glenmire, who had seen many curious sights in Edinburgh, was very much struck with the tricks, and would not at all agree with Miss Pole, who declared that anybody could do them with a little practice, and that she would herself undertake to do all that he did, with 2 hours given to study the encyclopedia and make her third finger flexible. At last, Miss Matty and Mrs. Forrester became perfectly awe-stricken. They whispered together. I sat just behind them, so I could not help hearing what they were saying. Miss Matty asked Mrs. Forrester if she thought it was quite right to have come to see such things. She could not help fearing they were lending encouragement to something that was not quite. A little shake of the head filled up the blank. Mrs. Forrester replied that the same thought had crossed her mind. She too was feeling very uncomfortable. It was so very strange. She was quite certain that it was her pocket handkerchief which was in that loaf just now, and it had been in her own hand not 5 minutes before. She wondered who had furnished the bread. She was sure it could not be Dacon, because he was the churchwarden. Suddenly Miss Matty half turned towards me. "Will you look, my dear? You are a stranger in the town, and it won't give rise to unpleasant reports. Will you just look round and see if the rector is here? If he is, I think we may conclude that this wonderful man is sanctioned by the church, and that will be a great relief to my mind." I looked, and I saw the tall, thin, dry, dusty rector sitting surrounded by national schoolboys, guarded by troops of his own sex from any approach of the many Cranford spinsters. His kind face was all agape with broad smiles, and the boys around him were in chinks of laughing. I told Miss Matty that the church was smiling approval, which set her mind at ease. I have never named Mr. Hayter, the rector, because I, as a well-to-do and happy young woman, never came in contact with him. He was an old bachelor, but as afraid of matrimonial reports getting abroad about him as any girl of 18, and he would rush into a shop or dive down an entry sooner than encounter any of the Cranford ladies in the street. And as for the preference parties, I did not wonder at his not accepting invitations to them. To tell the truth, I always suspected Miss Pole of having given very vigorous chase to Mr. Hayter when he first came to Cranford, and not the less because now she appeared to share so vividly in his dread lest her name should ever be coupled with his. He found all his interests among the poor and helpless. He had treated the national schoolboys this very night to the performance, and virtue was for once its own reward, for they guarded him right and left, and clung round him as if he had been the queen bee and they the swarm. He felt so safe in their environment that he could even afford to give our party a bow as we filed out. Miss Pole ignored his presence, and pretended to be absorbed in convincing us that we had been cheated, and had not seen Signor Brunoni after all. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. If you like what I do here, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, get me out there, share me with all your friends, and I'll be seeing you next time. Bye!